I was browsing around a little bit and came upon a small book about Barbara Hepworth, so I thought I'd make a short video about her and her work. I think it would be interesting to think about her relationship to material in a way that can be reflected on in a current or contemporary way. Barbara Hepworth was born in 1903 and grew up in a place called Wakefield, which was a small town in Yorkshire, England. She went to school at Leeds School of Art and the Royal College of Art in London. She lived mainly in a location called St. Ives throughout her adult life. It's a place on the Cornish coast of England, which, interestingly, and as an important side note, served as a rural refuge for many artists during the Second World War. It's funny how that works out. Um, Artists migrate to these somewhat special pockets of areas all the time. I would imagine that in a time of high stress and anxiety, finding refuge in a slower environment with less people would help one slow down a little bit at least. Especially for people who like to think deeply and have a more contemplative life. I have a strong guess that her environment and context shaped a lot of her observations and ideas over time. Hepworth was a founding member of the artists group Unit 1. The group consisted of John Armstrong, John Bigg, Edward Burra, Francis Hodgkins, Paul Nash, Ben Nicholson, Edward Wadsworth, and Henry Moore. Their intent as a group was to try to take a psychological approach to form through notions of surrealism and constructivism. The group dissolved 2 years later in 1935, and I think the thing that was important about this was that the principles approached in the group were things that Hepworth carried into her practice well into the future. Ideas like exploring the unconscious and metaphysical dimensions of abstraction that suggest a relationship between the body and form as flexible and fluid in relation to materials and forms that at least appear static. In 1941, Barbara Hepworth wrote a letter to the critic Herbert Reed about the relationship between Gestalt psychology and constructivism. She stated that constructivism does not do away with imagery. In fact, it contains the most easily understood use of images, basic forms of the rhythm of the landscape. They are organic, capable of infinite variation, and are socially significant from primitive man onward. I could write a book about the crystal and the potato. I think having a quick overview of the terms Gestalt, psychology, and constructivism could be helpful here because I think it's always a good idea to review and expand on a topic. Broadly, Gestalt psychology is focused on a theory of perception that emphasizes the processes of entire patterns and configurations, and not merely individual components. An example I like to think of is a car. Acknowledging a car as a whole unit or thing that operates as a single entity and system rather than thinking of it as a series of individual components within an organized system where various elements respond to one another with some form of initial stimulus, like a hand turning a crank or a lever. Constructivism, in terms of the arts, is an early 20th century art movement based in the Soviet Union that was founded in 1915 by Vladimir Tatlin and Alexander Rodchenko. Constructivism was a post-World War I development of Russian futurism that had a great effect on modern art movements of the 20th century, influencing major trends such as the Bauhaus and De Stijl movements. Constructivism as a theory and practice was derived largely from a series of debates at the Institute of Artistic Culture in Moscow from 1920 to 1922. After deposing its first chairman, Wasily Kandinsky, for his mysticism, the first working group of constructivists developed a definition of constructivism as the combination of two things, factura and tectonica. A factura means, at least very loosely, the particular material properties of an object, and tectonica, again, very loosely refers to its spatial presence. Anyhow, these are just some quick statements about these ideas, but they will at least give a taste of what they're about for, just for quick reference. Hepworth was trying to connect her ideas about form to a metaphysical experience of interior space and the groundedness of social realities in her time, which, funny enough, many artists working today are thinking through as well. She believed in the spiritual significance of art and thought that it held the possibility for utopian social change, even with all the disenchantment that came from World War I and II. What her vision of utopia was, I can guess, but I would need to familiarize myself with more to be able to articulate at a later time. One thing is for sure, utopia as an idea, like any far extension towards a purified ideal, also harbors its opposite. But I can understand the desire for a type of reduced suffering, especially with the climate like the world wars. Which, by the way, is wild to me that someone, as well as some of her peers, were living during the two world wars where there was so much tragedy, fear, and violence, and were able to tap into a sensitive and spiritual place. One thing I thought was interesting about Barbara Hepworth was this relationship between the craftsman's hand, material understanding, and its relationship to the revealing of form. This idea that her thinking hand, in this case her left hand, as her calculated and measured hand, was a conduit for her thoughts. That it was a connection to her mind and intent, as well as an aid in understanding the material she was working with for a work of art. That the eyes can see in some ways, but so can the hands and other parts of the human body as a way of creating and thinking. It makes me think about, maybe she used her whole body as a thinking, feeling, and responding entity in dialogue with another entity. In this case, the thing that she's working on or working with. It's like a dance where there's some give and take on both sides. I don't think she was as interested in forcing the material to conform to a form that she had originally conceived of, but rather that the form can emerge from a collaborative event. But that's just my interpretation of what I've read and learned. Even with cast forms, she still had a strong desire for the ability or opportunity to directly carve material rather than build material up or out with something like clay. I really love Hepworth's relationship between the use of her body as an intuitive way of understanding something and also using its vulnerability to acknowledge the qualities of the materials she was working with. Hepworth's work at least to me, also engages a relationship between the spectator, landscape, and the unconscious. There's this tension and focus on interiority and exteriority that I really love. There's a grayness within the tension that leaves room for in-betweenness and the minutiae of a shifting gaze between inside, outside, through, and around. The negative space is as important as the positive and that oscillation between both is absolutely fascinating to me. Even though a lot of her works are abstract or non-representational, some do have a sort of projected referent, either through a naming convention like child with mother, conversation with magic stones, or disc with strings. I think that these projections can vary a bit, with some feeling very cold and objective, such as disc with strings, to something more akin to a feeling that can be associated with a space between objects, such as conversation with magic stones and child with mother. I actually think that the titling in this sense is extremely important because it kind of establishes a relational tension and projected fantasy that's significant but invisible. A part of this could be a type of engagement from the viewer or participant, which might tap into their own interiority and projected fantasy of space, energy, and tension. All of this to say that I think her work is incredible, and it gets me thinking. I probably need to visit a museum somewhere or see one of her works in person or keep an eye open for when or where there might be an exhibition I can visit. But this is just a quick set of reflections. There's so much to say and wonder about, and I'm sure that her work will unfold for me over time in new ways that I didn't think of yet. But I also don't know how much of a particular type of analytical or linguistic logic will make more sense of the work itself. I think, at least for me, her work needs to be experienced in person, so I have a new item on my bucket list of stuff to look out for. Thanks for listening, and I hope this video gave you something interesting to think about.